there's a lot to be said for knowing what you have to offer and knowing what the number is that you're looking for. So a couple tips are first to really believe in what you're asking. So in that particular case, I knew that we were doing like the top, 80, 90% of MGA volume, but we were paid at like the 30% or below MGA value. So, it really wasn't a hard sell, so I knew going in there that I had the belief that it was worthy, and I knew that I could get something out of it.
Welcome to the Physicians and Properties Podcast, the show where we teach you how investing in real estate can give you the freedom to practice medicine and live life how you want.
Doctor! 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 Doctor!
Now, here's your host, Dr. Alex Schlow.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Physicians and Properties Podcast. I'm so excited for our guest today, Dr. Amy Vertrees, to have her on the podcast. She's a boss, and you'll learn more about what that means here soon. She's a board-certified general surgeon, also was an Army veteran. She did 17 years in the Army and left the Army as a lieutenant colonel and deployed 3 times. So really excited to share her journey and her experience in the Army. She's built a very successful private practice, and she's the founder of Boss Business of Surgery series. She does coaching. She's also an author. She's a woman of many talents. Amy, so grateful to have you on the podcast today. How are things going?
Great. Thank you so much for having me on. Such an honor.
Absolutely. Well, the honor's all mine, and I'm really excited to share your journey on the podcast tonight. Let's kind of start from the beginning. What led you to medicine? And then I'd also love to hear why the Army and how was that experience?
So my dad was in the Army. He's a Vietnam War veteran. And so we moved around a lot when I was younger. And so that lifestyle seemed pretty reasonable to me. Didn't know any different. And I was interested in medicine, science, math, anatomy, all those things, and just really gravitated towards the sciences, and went to Georgia Tech and realized I wanted to go into medicine, become a doctor. So that's, what I ended up doing. I took a little bit of a detour there, probably not really relevant at this point, but, took a detour in graduate school, realized that wasn't for me. And then I ended up in, interesting enough, the military medical school. A lot of people have not heard of USUHS, the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in Bethesda, Maryland. And I just remember sitting in a coffee shop, figuring out where I wanted to go. I was in Florida at the time, and the schools didn't call to me. And I looked at this Kaplan book, and it said that the best kept secret in medicine was up there. And I was like, I know Army, I can do that. And so I applied and I went up there, and I just absolutely loved it. It was a fantastic school, great education. And, I joined in 2000 before any wars happened. So it was certainly a different military that I entered into than I ended up serving in, that's for sure. So it was just something that was interesting. And I think we're all just kind of interested in becoming, the best version of ourselves and expanding and trying new things. And so it felt different and unusual and interesting. And I knew that it was going to be interesting. I had no idea just how interesting.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive more into that because, the military I was in was also significantly different than the military that you experienced. And so I'm really grateful for your service, especially that time too. What a just wild time in American history. And of course, with the Iraq War and Afghanistan and everything that was happening at that point in time, I don't think folks really appreciate all the sacrifice that happened there, especially with, unfortunately, how things kind of ended and the drawdown and everything. And so thanks for your service and thank you to your dad as well, Vietnam vet. I love military history. I've been really leaning into lately, learning more and more about Vietnam and just like what a fascinating war and what just, incredible stories of sacrifice that the men have that went over there and just something that's not talked about enough. And so I'm glad to see like more and more podcasts and more people coming and sharing about their experience in Vietnam. So anyways, all that to say, incredibly grateful over here for you and for your family. And thank you for that. I want to just kind of clarify for folks who are listening, who are thinking about the military as a route for medical school and after. So do you mind kind of explaining the difference between USUHS, which is an amazing medical school, and I'll kind of talk about the HPSP program, and we'll kind of compare and contrast the differences for the folks that are listening.
Yeah, absolutely. The USUHS is a bit of a bigger commitment. So when you apply for medical school, you're also applying to be commissioned into one of the armed services. So when you get accepted, you also become commissioned as an officer in the military. And it's a tri-service school. So I chose the Army branch. And then we are basically officers in the military. You get the rank, the benefit, the pay. Then they pay for school. So I actually got paid to go to school with all the benefits of an Army officer. And those 4 years will count at the end of the service. So we were able to just be military officers. So we wore uniforms and, our casual day was like our camouflage, otherwise we were wearing our, usual business attire. And we went a lot of trainings. And so we had 2 big military training exercises. One, we were in our first year of medical school, in between first and second year. And then also later something called Bushmaster in our 4th year, which was really putting us in the operational setting. And, they had a lot of fun with us too. First year too, we went to Quantico with the Marines. They had a lot of fun with us too. I'm pretty sure we were there for their entertainment. But so we got to really be a part of the military. And interestingly enough, in between our first and second year, we were required to do a military rotation of like just 2 weeks to really embed yourself into the military and to understand what it's like. So I was one of the people in our class. We had a class of over 160 people. One person a year was chosen to go to the White House to serve with and it was great. I was chosen for my class. Unfortunately, but ended up being fortunate, because they were having an administrative change, the administrations were changing. So they said, you really can't go this year. They just don't want anyone right this summer. I was like, well, that's a bummer. So I ended up going to CENTCOM instead in Tampa. And this was the summer of 2001. And so it was a few months before September 11th. So I actually ended up meeting a lot of people that ended up being on the news as we begun the war. So it was a really interesting time to be in that particular location. So by them allowing us to go in the military, I actually got to really experience it, and I got a unique experience. I was also there with the Special Ops Command to where they showed some of the missions that they do, and they shared a lot of things with me and told me, say, like, don't talk about this, it's secret. I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Your secret's safe with me. But it was really great to be a part of that because they, I was like a little kid to them, and they showed me like through all the different areas. They showed me what a general goes through to get briefed for all the news things and how they put all these war plans together. It was really, really phenomenal. And my project that year that 2 weeks was to help the special ops learn how to, do better IVs, which I'm a first year medical student. What do I know? Anyway, so I appeared with the junior college there and helped them and come to find out, a few months later, some of them are really actually going to war. So it was a really surreal kind of time to have an accidental disappointment, turn into something that was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's tough. Army might be a little bit different, but Air Force, sometimes you don't feel as connected to the mission depending on where you're stationed. And so it's really cool that you had that experience and you were able to like really feel embedded in there. And then of course, with, everything that subsequently was to come, I'm sure you felt very much a part of the Army, but that's such a cool experience. Yeah. HPSP, for folks who are listening, that's how I went into the military, the Health Promotion Scholarship Program. And so there are a few things that are different. The commitment is a little bit shorter. So I think for USUHS, it's 8 years. For
it's
HPSP,
7 years after residency.
Okay. Oh, 7. Okay. 4 for us after residency for HPSP. So basically 1 for your medical school, but similar. You get a stipend. It's not full officer pay, but you get a stipend while you're in med school. I want to say mine was $2,064, which I thought I was living large in med school with $2,000 a month going into my bank account. But and then you do some different trainings in between different years of med school. So first year commissioned officer training, and then I did some aerospace medicine courses and stuff as well, and then rotations throughout med school. But it's a really great experience. I talk to people, a lot of med students, about the military, and I am incredibly grateful for it. I think it was a really great opportunity. Incredible training. If I can speak to the family medicine side, I feel like the training that we get in family medicine in the military is just amazing, and you get a lot of extra stuff, like a lot more trauma and emergency medicine. And we probably do a bit more surgery rotations than typical and deliver a lot more babies. And so it was just a really, really cool opportunity that I'm grateful for. And then just having the opportunity to put the uniform on every day. It was weird getting out and then having to think about what to wear because you get so used to just throwing the uniform on every day. But I'm grateful for that experience. And for folks who are listening, who are interested, if you feel like you want to be in the military, it can be a great opportunity for you. But I think if you want to just have med school paid for and you don't have a desire to serve the country, it might not be the best opportunity. But anyways, that's my Air Force tangent, HPSP tangent, but hopefully it helps answer some questions there for folks. So you spent 17 years in the Army and deployed 3 times. Do you mind sharing a little bit more about kind of what day-to-day looked like for you during that time? I know you had multiple different roles during that time frame, but what was that like for you?
Yeah, honestly, really started at Walter Reed. So we saw the first war injured people. And when I was a resident was really when the wars ramped up with Afghanistan and Iraq. And so we would get war injured every Tuesday and Sunday. And because they were coming from Landstuhl in Germany, we would typically get a lot of the information ahead of time. So really got immersed in a lot of the injuries and injury patterns that had happened, and really helped me appreciate just how diverse these injuries were, and really participating in the care when they came back. And so I had an understanding of some of the injury patterns we would see, and also actually started our military injury database and did a lot of publications related to that. So when my time came, because we're not deployable till we finish residency. So we finished residency, and also very grateful to Maryland Shock Trauma that we did a lot of our trauma training up there, and that was absolutely phenomenal. Dr. Scalea really prepared us for that too, including things like allowing us to do hand-sewn anastomoses and things like that too. He was a really huge supporter of our military surgeons. So my first deployment was to Afghanistan in 2011. I was in Jalalabad, and Afghanistan has like basically a mountain range in the middle of it. There's deserts to the southwest, and then a mountain range. And I was in Jalalabad, which is in the mountains. So I was there, and it's next to like a CIA compound and stuff. It was actually on the Oh Dark 30 movie. I was there at that time when they captured bin Laden. We met the military SEAL portion of the SEAL team. We didn't see the SEAL team themselves, and didn't do anything. I was just nearby. But
that's so anyway, cool though.
It was very cool because they would come by all the time. Like, oh, we got a big mission. And we're like, oh yeah, sure. And then I'm in the gym tent, and I'm like on the treadmill. I was like, what just happened? Anyway, so it was a time in 2011 that was very, very busy in that time frame, and a lot of the fighting happened at night. So it was always kind of hard to figure out when to stay awake, when to sleep. And there was a period of time of a couple weeks where we were getting just constant injuries, or patients that were injured. And you never knew what you're going to get. I mean, we would get like a 9-line medevac and say, we've got a certain number of casualties and things. And there were definitely some pretty remarkable things that came up. So the 9-line medevac just basically tells you, here's the number of casualties, here's approximate number of injuries and the stability of them so we could prepare, and the estimated time of arrival. And sometimes you'll say like, they're unstable and they come in, they look okay. And then sometimes you're like, oh, these doesn't sound like it's going to be bad. And you open up the ambulance back door and they're like doing CPR. So we never knew exactly what you're going to get. And, to put some perspective in there, we basically had an ultrasound and an x-ray. There's no CT scanner. There's no laparoscopic equipment. There's certainly no robot. And we had a really phenomenal program of whole blood system. So we were co-located with a Charlie Med. So we had the ability to manage a lot more casualties and expand because we had some more personnel. Because I was part of a full FST, which is about, I think we're like 20 people. But the Charlie Med had more people. And if we needed whole blood, you basically just say, hey, I need blood. And they would call over the loudspeaker, whatever blood type, because we screened them ahead of time. And then before you know it, within 30 minutes, you had blood in hand. So it was a really phenomenal thing. And we did have to call some of those massive transfusion protocols a couple of times. So that one was really busy. And there were times where like we had CRNAs were our anesthesia folks. And there were times when you had like 2 people like head to head, like they were managing anesthesia for 2 people at once. And wow. It was a pretty phenomenally challenging time. And then you'd have, run-of-the-mill appendicitis, diverticulitis, things like that. And so it was a really interesting time to be there. My first deployment was probably the busiest. My second deployment was in 2013, and that was in the Helmand province in Dwyer. So this was in the desert, and it's really actually completely different. It's like a different country. So there's a desert. The very first day we touched down, there's like this massive sandstorm. I've got a great picture. It looks like straight out The Mummy. But we went to like this was downsizing at the time in Afghanistan. So we were in a tent, and there was like a big metal box that was for our OR, and it would get extraordinarily hot there. And so I just remember remember there's one time we were operating, and this guy came in, and I had to scrub out, and I basically I had to throw up because it was so hot. It was that bad.
Wow.
It was interesting. Our CNA, he said, I looked up over the curtain and you were gone. So I came right back. Anyway, it was crazy. And then that was also really cool because the British Special Forces they land, and then we would help with any injured that they had before going to Bastion, which is the British hospital. So we had a lot of collaborations with there. And I had a friend who's over at Bastion. So when I said some there, I could, give him a briefing of what we had. And I remember this one in particular where I said, everything's injured, all of it.
No.
Everything's injured. And I was there with an orthopedic surgeon. We were a split FST then too. We still had the capability of doing whole blood, but fortunately we didn't need as much. But you do have to make some tough decisions because we had one where there was, multiple casualties we got. It was just, orthopedic surgeon. And they would use explosive devices that include like the equipment. So whenever we were drawing things down, you had to be very careful, which was what was around, because they could use that as in part of the bombs. And so we were taking down beds, and they had these like really long bolts and then nuts. And we had this one guy came in where a bolt was actually into his temporal lobe, and the other guy, the nut was in his pelvis. And he had some abdominal pain. I thought, okay, fine. It looked like maybe right colon, something like that. Well, when we got in there, interesting enough, the nut part of that had blown through the side of his hip and had actually formed the back wall of the common iliac vein. And so, because when I opened the pelvis or opened the abdomen, I was like, it was pristine. I was like, this is not good. And so I was able to kind of find the common iliac vein and isolate it, and, thought about repairing it. By that time, we'd already used our blood. And I think we only had like maybe 20 units. I think we had used 11. So ended up just packing them and sending them to Bastion after isolating the injury. And putting I can't think of it right now, not tourniquets, but was able to kind of like pack them off, send them to Bastion, where it ended up stretching their resources too. But that he lived, had to a repair of that, of course. The other guy lived too, debrided of his temporal lobe and repair like that too. So it's really remarkable to be able to hear, because we would have these weekly meetings, like basically just briefings of hearing what happened. And it was great too, because I remember at Walter Reed, when we participated there, we saw the injuries. We knew the final story, but to hear them, how they worked up people, how they treated people, was really helpful to hear and understand and get the full breadth of it too. So I was really, it didn't really feel special at the time because everybody was doing it. But, when you get past that, you're like, gosh, that was really a phenomenal time in the military. And my third deployment was in the northern part of Iraq in Kurdistan and at Erbil. It's interesting because I felt fairly safe in there. Our FST was out of the old airport, and there was a big city. Interesting enough, there's like a lot of cranes still, as if they were constructing the big city. Apparently they'd been there for decades because it kind of ran out of money, and they're just abandoned buildings in some of those areas, from what I understood. But that was an interesting thing. That was a very multinational thing. We were there with multiple countries. There was, British surgeons. There was a Canadian surgeon. It was really great to get to know a lot of different people from different countries and how their medical systems work and how their deployment systems work, which were far different. Like, for example, the Germans would only go for a few weeks at a time, whereas we would typically go anywhere from 5 to 6 to more months on deployments. But they would basically just rotate, short rotations, and they had them planned out for 2 years in advance, where we were like, hey, you're leaving in a month. And so it was interesting just to see, like, all three deployments wildly different, and each I really gained a lot from, but really certainly an appreciation for what the American military is able to do. And I'll never forget this quote, which someone said, is like, we are a necessary military asset, because they know that they can push themselves, and they know that they can potentially put themselves in harm's way, because if they get an ambulance or a helicopter and they get to us, that we will save them. And that was a huge honor, a lot of pressure, but it was really, talk about like feeling like you had a purpose, and knowing like that camaraderie of saying that, you're there fighting for us, and we are here to make sure that you go home. So that's pretty much the summation of the highlights, I guess.
That's amazing. Yeah. Again, thank you. I could talk to you about that for many, many more hours, because it's just fascinating. And just, I hopefully folks really take the gravity seriously of what you did and what you guys were doing there and what you were capable of doing with really minimal resources. And you'll think this is really cool. It actually just got published last week. We started when I was in residency, 2020, I think, was when we first started working on this project, but we were looking at aerial delivery of whole blood and hey, would it be able to be transfusible? And we called it Operation Blood Rain, kind of as a joke. And then we would draw whole blood off of each other, just some residents and some techs, and we'd package it up in this like really fancy, expensive cooler, and then we'd throw it out of airplanes, C-145s, and then we would take it immediately to the lab and see, hey, did it meet criteria to be transfusible? And it did, and it was just really, really cool. And then we ended up we wrote some research papers and we entered it into what's called the Spark Tank in the Air Force. And we ended up winning that, which was really cool. But it just got published in Deployed Medicine. It's operational practice guideline now. Aerial delivery of fresh and stored blood products. Thank you. I was only a tiny, tiny part of it, but some of my blood got thrown out of an airplane and it was able to be transfused at one point. And well, you'll appreciate this too. We were going out for the first time to test it. We were at Hurlburt Field, which is where a lot of the special operations are for the Air Force. And we loaded up everything into the C-145 and I was on the ground and they were flying in, they were getting ready to drop the blood. And the commander of the base called and was like, should we be doing this? Like what happens if like blood goes everywhere? And we're in the middle of like the reserve of Eglin, and we're like, well, like, I don't know. It's probably not a big deal, right? And then one of the docs we were with, who's a special ops doc, he was like, "We're just gonna do this," and so we did, and everything was great. And we were like, "What if we get one of these like blood bags stuck in a tree, or the cooler gets stuck? What are we gonna do?" And it was just really funny, and you can relate to like, hey, last minute in the military, we've been planning this for months, talked with everybody, got all these approvals, and right as we're about to drop these bags of blood is when they're like, "Yeah, maybe we shouldn't do this." But anyways, it worked out. And December 1st, that was published, the operational practice guideline for deployed medicine. So really, really cool. Dr. Rosalind Fuentes really led the push there, and she's amazing. And it was just a really cool experience that it's awesome to have those experiences in the military that you're like, I would never have got this in private practice. And so anyways, so really, really cool opportunity. And I'm grateful for that time as well. I did want to ask one more question though. Wow, how far out of residency were you on that first deployment?
I finished residency in 2010 and I deployed, like maybe January 2011. So yeah, within a year.
Okay.
Pretty typical that time.
Well, yeah. What was that like for you? Do you remember like kind of emotions, feelings? Were you excited? Were you scared? All the above? What was that like?
I actually, it's so funny you mentioned that because I was moving around some stuff on a bookshelf and I came across, I had this spiral bound notebook and, I was always like the gunner, the A+ student kind of thing, so I had basically copies of the anatomy and all like meticulous notes and, felt like I studied all the time because, you have to do everything. My first deployment, I did neck explorations. We did thoracotomies. There was, pancreas injury. And I remember there was a explosion where the pubic symphysis like tore and it tore like the bladder deep in the pelvis. And so we learned this technique, open the bladder and repair it from the inside and things like that. And there was just, and we were capable. And that's the one thing that I think was really remarkable that I really try to emphasize to people who weren't in the military is like, we were told we could do it. So therefore we became capable of doing it. And I think that in this day and age, everyone's so scared of people doing stuff that like, you can't do this. You can only do a little this. And, and maybe you should be asking somebody else. And that just was not what was our training was. We were enabled from the very beginning and said, you're going to do this. And it was really, it was tough because you had to be capable of doing so much. And I'm really fortunate because, Walter Reed, we had the best training for sure. Like I left there highly capable and also empowered by all the things that we learned from our training. So I felt okay, but like each trauma, it was just rough. And it's a very weird experience because like in the hospital, you're expected to have complete ownership of your patients. And when you're deployed, it's this like really intense, you do everything that you can. You're trying to figure out what the problem is. You're trying to diagnose it with the stuff you had. And then all of a sudden, like the plane comes, they're gone. And you're just like, what just happened? And then the FST goes silent because there's nobody there. And, after that really intense thing, and then that person's out of your hands. And sometimes, luckily, we were able to usually figure out what happened to people. But if they were Afghans or Iraqis and went to whatever part of the country they're from, you may not actually know what happened to them. But either way, it's like the intense stabilize and they go away. It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe not as much closure. And you kind of saw the whole spectrum, right? Being there as in the FST, and then also, getting started at Walter Reed when the war was starting. So you kind of saw that whole continuum and loop of everything that happened. And so that was probably really interesting to see from both sides. I would have liked knowing the closure, knowing what happened, but that is interesting that's the case. That sometimes you just do the best you can, and then they're gone, and hopefully everything worked out, in their favor. I'm sure there were some certainly challenging times during that experience. After you got out of the military, what was next for you?
So, yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. The Boss Business and Surgery series started in 2015 when I was working on getting out of the military. I knew 2017 was my end date. And there were all the things that I needed to know, like CVs and negotiating and all the stuff, like coding. I had no idea. I mean, the military is like, we just don't have to worry about a lot of those things. So
Monopoly money.
Yeah, and money.
That's what I used to
exactly.
say.
It's funny. Our salaries were actually literally determined by Congress.
Yeah.
It would take
and yours was like, I don't know, probably a third of what general surgeons actually make. Even family medicine is like half of what family medicines typically make. But isn't that crazy?
Well, what's really ironic, and I talk about this all the time in my group when we talk about money, because I never actually thought about how much I made. Because it didn't matter. I mean, what am I going to do? Like ask for more? It's never going to happen. So, and, honestly, like the salary wasn't much, but I left with no debt. And in fact, because they paid me throughout all of this, and I actually was in the DC area for the entire 17 years, unlike a lot of people. And because when I finished residency, they asked me to stay. And so, yeah, it's funny because I really literally had no idea how much I made. I just made what I made. And then I just remember like the visceral fear of like, how am I going to ask for what I'm worth? And how do I negotiate for all those things? And so the necessity is a mother of invention. And so I created the Boss Business of Surgery series as a way to figure out those things, because I figured if I needed to know, then other people needed to know. And I think that's where a lot of good business ideas come from, is when you find it a need and you fill it. So it was interesting at that time. I think it was a really good idea at the time, but 2015, people weren't doing stuff. I mean, I thought I was like phenomenal to get like a website. I was so proud of it. And then when I pulled in my phone, I was like, this is crazy. And then, but like any entrepreneur, and I understand it now, is like the very first roadblock you have, like, oh, that's it. This was a dumb idea. And then you stop. And I was preparing for my third deployment at that time. And so I kind of let it go. And it wasn't until, COVID in 2020 that it picked up again. And that came from my experience, long-winded way to answer your question. After the military, I did what everyone said we're supposed to do. And this, goes into the messages that we get. Everyone says you have to get employed jobs. So I had an interview at a private practice in Nashville, and then an employed job at a community hospital. And I was actually really drawn to the community hospital to be able to continue to do the full breadth that we were told we could do and were doing in the Army. So I was really gravitated towards the community hospital. So that's where I ended up going, and it was very, very happy. And I was happy with the patients in the OR and things like that, but I was not particularly happy with the clinic. And there were I felt the administrative lack of autonomy and things like that. And so I discovered coaching this time. I'd never heard of it before. And this was 2020. And I was like, that's great. I'm going to use it to negotiate, because we were not getting paid much per RVU based on MGMA data, now that I actually knew what that was. So I negotiated actually a phenomenal raise. And then 3 months later, I quit.
Hey, it was good practice though, and great for those 3 months.
Yeah, well, it was. Yeah. It's interesting because it's not money. Money does not make you happy. And that's, what I've learned through the military and employed medicine and private practice. It's really not about the money. And we think it's about the money, but it's not. That's actually an employee trap.
It's, I do think money can offer some flexibility and some freedom, and I think that's what you're looking for. And kind of return of that autonomy and control and being able to practice medicine to your full scope and those sorts of things. And that's what really fills folks up. I wanted to hit on the negotiation piece real quick, because this is something that is close to my heart, because I also learned none of this and then got out of the military in June. And I practice part-time now, and really fortunate for that. I do direct primary care and then some per diem work for a big medical system here. And I didn't know anything about negotiating. And in the direct primary care practice, I didn't really need to negotiate that. But for the per diem, I had a guest on the podcast, and she does a lot of locums and per diem work. And she's like, you got to negotiate. And so anyways, long story short, they initially said the rate that they were going to pay me. And so I reached out to her like, hey, what do you think? She's like, no, you need to ask for like $800 more or something like that. Like, you're worth way more. And I was like, I don't know. This seems like a lot of money, because, comparing it to the Air Force. And so anyways, I did. And they came back and they're like, oh, well, we won't do $800 more, but we'll do $500 more. And I was like, okay. And so it's like, just so simple. It's like, hey, we're going to pay me $500 more shift just because I sent one email. So that's not how you properly negotiate. But I say that to say, like, had I not asked, they certainly weren't going to offer that they were going to pay me $500 more. And so anyways, what are some tips and tricks that you've learned about negotiating salaries for folks and getting set up in private practice?
So the negotiating, there's a lot to it. So that particular negotiation about increasing the amount per RVU was not as hard as I thought it was going to be. So I read Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference, and I used a lot of his techniques. And over the last few years, I've really developed a lot more nuance that have helped tremendously. But in that particular instance, it was all about money and good relationships. So I had good relationships with the people that I was negotiating with, and I knew my value. And so there's a lot to be said for knowing what you have to offer and knowing what the number is that you're looking for. So a couple tips are, first, to really believe in what you're asking. So in that particular case, I knew that we were doing like the top 80-90% of MGA volume, but we were paid at like the 30% or below MGA value. So, it really wasn't a hard sell, so I knew going in there that I had the belief that it was worthy, and I knew that I could get something out of it. I think we were getting like $37 per RVU. And I had in mind, I was like, we should be able to at least get in the 40s. This is just ridiculous. So anyway, I felt, perfectly fine asking, and said, hey, just made it conversational and felt pretty relaxed about it. Really not raising the emotional fear in the other person, which I know a lot of negotiations, they're emotional, they're not logical. So it was a conversation, and the specific techniques that Chris Voss talked about really helped. So I said, well, we're not making MGMA numbers. I said, no numbers. I said, well, you're not. And he's like, well, what are you looking for? I was like, well, the MGA numbers just like I do. I just really think that we need to talk about, getting a little bit more in line with what a general surgeon should be making. And I just kept stalling and not saying a number. And then they said, well, I don't know. We were thinking about like maybe we could start with $54 per RVU. I'm like, I guess I could do that. So It was just really crazy but I had prepared for a high anchor. So they said, if you're thinking of a number, to put like the number that you have as a low part and then do a high anchor. Is like, so in that instance, I could have said, I was really looking more like, well, and then even then you're not just saying I demand this or, I do this. It's usually just conversational. Like, MGMA, I've seen, anywhere from like $45 to $65 per RVU. So, the numbers. We're just wanting to look for what's really helpful for a general surgeon. And he said, don't hit the triggers like, know my worth and my value and being fair. Like all those things are very alarming. But if you make it like, I don't know, the numbers. Like I'm just a doctor.
Yeah, exactly. That is awesome. That is an amazing book, Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. If folks haven't read it, please tell me you used his classic, like, well, how do you expect me to do that? I feel like he always says that. How do you expect me to do that?
Exactly.
And then using like the odd numbers when you're negotiating, like $997.97 instead of $1,000, and those sorts of things. But that is cool. That is a great way to do it too. And it's, you're right. You kept the emotions out of it, and they probably felt so much more comfortable. And look at like what you were able to get. You were going in shooting for like, hey, maybe in the 40s, and then they offer 54. Great, that's awesome. I should have read that book before I just like sent an email and asked to be paid a bit more.
Well, I mean, even just the ability to put it out there in the first place is engaging. And, it's much more sophisticated than what I did when I first got the contract, because I just happened to notice in looking at the contract that there were certain things that were bold. And so they all seemed to be, I was like, these all look like they would be flexible. I was like, I think they bolded it to see. And so everything that was bolded, I asked for more.
That is awesome. That is awesome. Very cool. Well, what are, let's talk a little bit more about Boss, and everything that you've done and you've learned and you've taught. What are some of the key pillars or things that you've learned either from Become the Boss MD, which is your book, which I'd love to hear, what that experience was like, but also the Business of Surgery series. What are some other things that tend to come up quite often and that you help coach physicians on?
Yeah, I definitely understand that there's like very specific things that come up. And so the military helped understand in like camaraderie and leadership. That was really pushed on us. We got leadership positions early and often. So we really learned how to interact with other people. So a lot of my leadership comes from that. And then the employed position, I really understood how to work within a constrained system. And I used the resources around me for building and coding. So I met with our coders often, things like that. And then the real education came in 2020 when I started the private practice. So we didn't really talk about it, but I kind of sort of suddenly quit. And it actually wasn't sudden at all. I just knew like there was just this idea in my head. I was going to be complaining about the same things for the next 15 years. And in that moment, it felt intolerable. So I went on my own and started discovering all these things for myself. As I became the administrator in a setting, I started understanding what some of the administrators were trying to do, but weren't really communicating well why they needed to do some of those things. And, because I'd had a lot of conversations with people all along the way in the system, I understood things on a better level. And then as I learned coaching, I got my coaching certification in 2020. It's a different way to think. And the best way I know to describe it is instead of being a physician where we tell people what to do, we're used to figure out the problem, tell people what to do. And a coach is like the exact opposite. I actually draw information out and I help someone else decide what to do. And that changing of the framework of how we interact with other people, for one thing, is so much easier, but also helped me inspire other people around me to be the best that they are. I'm not telling them what to do. They're not sitting there waiting for me to tell them what to do. They're now figuring things out for themselves. And so the framework of the Boss Business of Surgery series became a few fundamental things, and then it's even continued to evolve. So I boiled down, my group program is a year, and it covers 3 months of dealing with difficult people, like difficult colleagues. I called it the difficult partner, but then people kept thinking it was your spouse. I was like, no, they're fine. But difficult colleagues, like what do people bring up in us? Because, if I have an interaction with someone, and this is where it's so confusing for people, we have an interaction with someone, we're like, they're wrong. And then you have this other guy like, I don't think they're that bad. So, I mean, it's interesting because there's something that someone brings out in us, and it's us understanding that and not trying to change other people, which makes a big difference. So 3 months of dealing with difficult people in the workplace, then 3 months of dealing with complications. And this is when, it's so funny because so many people in the group, I said this and they actually like blew their mind. I said, we have hard jobs, right? Like never occurs to us that our jobs are really hard.
Right.
But complications are when we do something. And how do you deal with the guilt, the shame, the worry? And then how do you tap into this idea that it's okay to be okay with yourself? And how do you support yourself through all these and have your own self-compassion and deal with the gravity of what we're meant to deal with? So we do that for 3 months. And then there's 3 months of power negotiating. This is where you kind of put both of those things together. When you figure out who you are and you're okay with who you are, and you're able to take risks because you're never going to harm yourself. And you also understand what other people set off in you, and you can use that to move the needle forward. That's really what power negotiating is. It's an interaction with two people, and you have to be very solid in yourself to be able to lead somebody else. And I call that lion taming. The person in front of you can be potentially very dangerous. And you're just like this dude with no weapons, except for the power that you can say, like, read their cues and say, we will not be doing that. ICU over there. We're not going to be doing that either. And you have the ability to actually settle someone down because most of the powerful things that we see are usually actually a fear-based stress response. So you start to manage other people's stress response. And then there's 3 months of, I call it Stop Hating Clinic. It's actually really like, I mean, I can't get you to love it. There's no false advertising here, but it's about how do you lead a clinic? How do you manage your time? How do you get paid? How do you inspire other people? How do you manage your time? And how do you make this job manageable? So there's a lot to that. And that really is where you step into the CEO role and you start to realize we're trained as employees. We're trained to do what we're told and we're trained to follow the rules. We are not trained to innovate and inspire and really tap into the value bank that we have that's vast as like the top 1% of educated people in the world. So that's where we really step out of the role of employee and step into you're the clinic CEO. You're the one managing people. You're the one making the big decisions. And you do this from your own personal missions and your values and your leadership style and less on what you think other people are telling you what to do. So
that's amazing. That was a masterclass right there. Thank you for that. Let's pull the thread a little bit of the CEO and thinking like a CEO, because I think this is really good and really, really important for folks to kind of understand. When you're saying, think like a CEO, act like a CEO, what do you think that looks like day to day? I guess if we can compare and contrast like the employee physician and the CEO physician, what do you think maybe the differences are in that mindset that is how they interact, differences in how they run the clinic, those sorts of things that you've seen in your experience? Hopefully that question makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's actually like really detailed. I remember we had a group call where we talked about CEO and employee mindset, and we actually broke it down into different things of like, how would you respond to this if you're the CEO versus how would you respond to this as an employee, which is typical saying like what is your source of power? Like, where do you gather your power as an employee? And, when you're an employee, you gain your powers like, well, they tell me what to do. There's a hierarchy and I just do what's told. And it's very clear. We have job descriptions and things like that. And the CEO is more innovative. It's like, this comes from my personal mission. This comes from the values that I have. This comes from my ability to lead other people and to inspire and be inspired by the people around me. Way different sources of power. And so you could see how one is very limited and one is not. I have a very specific example where I woke up one day and I was like, I solved a problem because I was thinking like an employee. And so we had a bit of a conflict with one of our hospitals. It's a really long story, but I was very disappointed with how something worked. And we really needed something for my practice to move forward, to allow us to expand and to really support my other partners, because the group itself has become different as we gain new partners. It changes the dynamics with each person. So anyway, we were really frustrated and I really couldn't solve this problem. I was like, how am I going to make our practice succeed? And I woke up one day, I was like, wait a minute, we're private practice. I'm not an employee. We can go to another health system. And that's exactly what we did. And so we found two hospitals nearby and we ended up getting a deal with these two hospitals to support them. And in return, they supported us. And so I was able to get another partner on an income guarantee. We were able to create call contracts that helped as private practice. Anything that gives you sustainable money is helpful because consistency is key in being able to survive. And it allowed us to really expand our practice. It was absolutely necessary to run into this roadblock, to realize if I think with innovation and we follow our values, which is to serve our patients, we're now serving them closer to home. We're helping hospitals, we're helping patients, we're helping our practice. We're all benefiting from it. And it came from that one morning, waking up saying, I cannot believe I fell for it. I can't believe I was just trying to follow the rules that didn't exist because I was not employed by this hospital system.
Right. You got to write the rules.
That was the best example I have of that.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. And I think that's a perfect example of like how powerful things can be if you don't have those constraints and those bottlenecks, and you can innovate and you can improvise, adapt, and overcome, as the military loves to say, and you're able to do that in private practice more so than as an employee. And that CEO role can be so important. Man, I love that. That is so awesome. Are there any? I want to be respectful of your time. I know it's a lot later where you are, and thanks for staying up late to do this podcast because it's been super valuable. But are there any, tips or tricks that you would recommend to a resident who's about to get into their first attending job? If you were to kind of rapid fire a few things for them to either learn about, think about, or just kind of understand the concepts are, what would that be?
Oh, I think, for one thing, your podcast is a great example because you're opening their eyes to something other than just medicine being a source of income. So you're tapping into the idea that they have a value bank that they have generated that is worth something beyond just generating an RVU. So by thinking outside of just the system that you're in, you can start thinking of innovation. And so I encourage them to expand beyond just medicine, read entrepreneur books, read business books, think and get inspired by these people around that are thinking differently than you are, and putting yourself in different rooms with different kinds of people, because we tend to gravitate towards the medicine folks, and which, of course we would. We're all in it together for sure. But every now and then just kind of drifting off and then learning something new, and learning from the people around you as well. If you want to know how the medical system works, talk to people that you wouldn't have otherwise. We tend to, as physicians, I think, talk to physicians. But if you talk to the coder, if you talk to the biller, if you talk to the nursing supervisor, and if you see what their problems are, and the CEOs too. I've talked to several CEOs now of hospitals, and I'm like, I can't believe they're not thinking about me and blah, blah, blah. And I hear their problems, and they're like, they've got big problems. They're not ignoring you. They've got big problems. So I think really not just looking inward at what you think about yourself, but looking outside and saying, I wonder what other people's problems are. I wonder what their perspectives are. These are simple and easy things I think we should all be doing every day, whether you're a resident or not, is making sure to always expand your perspective of your experience and your knowledge. And if you do that every single day, you're going to be worlds better than anyone else, because you will have consciously gained more knowledge in doing that. And so it's more, I would say, a practice of learning than it is what you specifically learn, because I think you're going to be pulled into areas that you have a specific interest in. And I think if you follow your interest, that's going to serve you well later in your career, because I think a lot of people follow what we're told to do and then start finding their interest. I think if you start tapping into your interest earlier, then it will allow you to follow a more authentic path than just what you're told to do.
I love that. That is a really great answer. And I think it goes back to the discussion earlier about negotiating too. Like the more emotional intelligence you're able to gain, and the more relationships and the more like heartfelt and genuine you are and become, like it's only going to continue to serve you going forward and lead you down that path to success. And I love too that you mentioned, kind of figuring out what your passions are and following them. It's really interesting talking to physicians or like looking at different physician Facebook groups and seeing like physicians just be really mean to other people who are doing other things other than just strictly practicing medicine. And I think having these other passions and these other things that you love and ways to serve people make you a better doctor, make you a more well-rounded doctor, help you take care of patients better, and help you, of course, with burnout and some of these other things that we experience. And so I love that you said that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And they can't be mean, but it's so interesting. Like if you think of what the underlying thought is that they're saying this, they say, I don't understand what you're doing.
Right. Why are you doing this? Yeah. Why would you be a doctor, but you also want to invest in real estate or start a business? Yeah. It's really funny. Like you had your whole life. Exactly. Yeah. Your whole life already planned out now and forever. But anyways, yeah, it is really funny. But I'm grateful for doctors like you who have really challenged others, really taught a lot of other people. I mean, I know you have changed so many lives in the military, out of the military, and now as well. And so thank you for doing that. Is there anything else you want to hit on here before we wrap things up? Any parting shots or final words that you have?
Yeah, the one thing you sparked something in me. I had a podcast a couple weeks ago about emotional capacity, and This is, I think, probably the most important lesson that I have learned is missing from residency. So we've learned skills because they told us how to operate. We have knowledge because we read a lot and we learned a lot. We have not really talked about emotional capacity. And emotional capacity, I think, is the ability to carry negative emotions and positive ones. So the positive emotions allow us to expand and carry the negative ones, because when you start, you're really excited, you're interested, you're motivated, but then you have your first complication or first setback or your first self-doubt. And then the doubt creeps in and the shame creeps in. And if you miss the inspiration and the sense of purpose, you will not be able to carry that dread and shame and worry. And so the ability to articulate what you're feeling and expand on it and understand why you feel bad, because usually we just say, I feel bad and I don't know what it is, and maybe I should leave, versus, oh, I'm feeling dread of what's to come because I haven't quite resolved how to approach surgeries, in a way that's logical. And those are ways that we can help solve problems when you start to understand it, because if you understand a problem, you've already half solved it. So I really wanted to mention that, because when he said that, I do think that's the main thing that's missing is we don't understand how we feel. And the more specific we are about it, we've half solved our problem. And so that's the main thing that I wanted to leave with.
Yeah, I love that. I'll add one more thing to that. I think not knowing how we feel and then not knowing how to address it or bring it up or feeling comfortable sharing that we're struggling with X, Y, or Z. And I've talked about it on the podcast before. I was dealing with a whole lot of anxiety, and I felt, like you mentioned, I felt a lot of weight and kind of couldn't even really figure out, hey, why am I so anxious? And I've, if I look back, honestly, I'm probably have always been a bit of an anxious person, but it was getting really bad and it was impacting my home life. I was snapping at my kids for things that were ridiculous. I mean, he was 3 at the time. Like, there were some things that were ridiculous, but it was like, hey, this is just not the dad I want to be. This is not the husband that I want to be. And once I finally admitted that I was dealing with this anxiety and started talking to a therapist and sought treatment and so forth, like, it was just like the biggest weight was lifted. And the funny thing was, I remember being so worried about, like, hey, how's that going to impact my career as a physician? Or, my PCM is one of my colleagues, and I remember talking with him. He was a PA. He was my PCM. We worked together every day. And I frankly, I kind of like broke down crying at this point and was talking to him about like how much anxiety I was having. And I had some panic symptoms and stuff at the time. And he's like, yeah, man, I already knew. I was just waiting for you to like come see me about it, and it's like, I'd known for the last year and I just didn't want to, bring it up. So that was really funny. And then, the next thing that creeps up is like, well, what if I go see, mental health on base and I'm going to see a therapist and I run into a patient? Then it's like, that's another thing that's like a roadblock, and all these things along the way. And then I realized, like, this is all ridiculous. If I go to the mental health and I see a patient that's great, at least they know, hey, my doc is taking care of his mental health. And it ultimately being such a great thing for me. And it was like just an enormous game changer in my life as a whole. And I think there's a lot of doctors who struggle with that because we don't know, like, hey, what are the ramifications going to be? What are other people going to think about us? And then we don't even, really take care of ourselves in that regard. So I do think it's really important to, figure out what are those weights that are holding you down? What are those emotions? How can you express them? And don't be afraid to express them, because I guarantee, almost 100% guarantee, with your like biggest fear of what may happen of you bringing that up and addressing that is probably not going to happen. And in fact, you're going to feel this huge weight be lifted.
Right. Exactly. It's so funny as you're saying this, like, what would a patient think? Like, if we're telling them that they should go see a therapist to help themselves out, but we're unwilling to do so. Like, like, it's good for you, but it's not good for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I saw patients there, and you know what they said? What's up, doc? And no one cared, and it just is what it was. And so, I think it's just so funny how the mind can play tricks on you. And as physicians, we feel like, almost we're, impervious to some of these things, anxiety, depression, and it's just funny. We need to take care of ourselves and be willing to do that and do it well. So anyways, I just hope that folks listening to this take something from that. And if you've learned something from this podcast, just share it with someone else who needs to hear it. Dr. Amy Vertrees, it's been amazing talking with you tonight. How can folks reach out to you if they want to know more, they want to learn how to lead their career career like a CEO, they want to check out the Business of Surgery series or get your book, how can they do that?
Yeah, so my book is Become the Boss MD, Success Beyond Residency. It follows a fictitious surgeon from getting a job to all the things, all the way through the career. So I really tried to hit on a lot of the highlights along the way of things you'll encounter in your career ahead of time in a way that's pretty easy and conversational. You can find that on Amazon. And my website is bosssurgery.com, or Boss Surgeon will also get you there. So bosssurgery.com, and that's where you can find links to the website. You can also find it on Apple. It's the Boss Business of Surgery series. Soon I'll have on the website, because we have over 200 episodes on the website. My VA has almost finalized this page where you go directly to that, and it's under different topics. So you'll see things like the clinic and, leadership, complications. They'll be a lot easier to find very specific things. And they really proud of that body of work, because I've been able to interview and really get a lot of valuable information of people who've experienced, well beyond my experience. That's the beauty of having an interview show, is you get to have a lot more experience. And I've just had some phenomenal guests on there too, which really make the show really amazing.
I agree. Yeah, having a podcast and getting to interview amazing folks like yourself, so much fun. I learned so much every time. And thank you again for making the time to be on the podcast tonight. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. It's been Dr. Amy Vertrees and Dr. Alex Schlow with another episode of the Physicians and Properties podcast. Signing off.
Hey, real quick, if you're still listening to this, I'm assuming you got value from it. So I need your help specifically. My 2-year vision with this podcast is to help 100,000 physicians learn how investing in real estate can give you the freedom to practice medicine and live life how you want. There are 2 main ways that a podcast grows. One is through ratings and reviews, and the other is word of mouth. If you can please leave me a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as send this to 1 to 2 friends that you think would get value from it, we can reach the physicians that we want to reach. Thanks in advance, and talk to you on the next episode. Please note that the information shared on this podcast is for informational purposes only. It should not be considered financial or medical advice. The views expressed on this podcast are those of the host and the guest and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Defense or the United States Air Force.